Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to IMI's Women's Wing webinar, New U.S. Dietary Guidelines, Maha Really. Today's webinar is part of the Health and Wellness series from IMI Women's Wing. I would like to start off today's program by sending my salams to the Imam of our time and the patron of Imamia Medics International, Sahib Asr wa Zaman, Ajallahu Ta'ala Farajahum, and to say Eid Mubarak to the true followers of the Ahlul Bayt on the occasion of his birthday. My name is Shoa, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. To share a bit about myself, I am an infectious disease epidemiologist at Yale University, where I focus on using data to solve public health problems such as outbreaks. My background is in global health and health policy, and I recently had the honor of being appointed as IMI's representative to the World Health Organization. A quick note about the format. We are currently live on YouTube. We will begin with a presentation from esteemed Dr. Vahida Karamali, after which she will begin to answer questions from the audience. We welcome you to please use the chat feature on YouTube at any time to ask questions for our speaker. We will compile these questions for the question and answer session of today's program. Before we begin, I would just like to share a bit about Dr. Vahida's background. She has a doctorate in public health in health policy and management from Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. She is, among many other things, a registered dietitian, clinical laboratory scientist, and diabetes educator. She has numerous accomplishments throughout her career as a special research scientist. Throughout her quite prolific research career in diabetes, she has been recognized by a vast list of the preeminent professional organizations in this space. Just to name a few, she is part of the board of directors for the American Diabetes Association. She was the national media spokesperson for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and she is a fellow of the National Lipid Association. She has spoken about diabetes and nutrition all around the world and done over 800 media interviews. So we are incredibly lucky to have her as part of our community, and to have her joining us today for this seminar on dietary guidelines for Americans. Dr. Vahida Karamali, thank you so much for being here with us today, and Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Shoa. And you should be recognized for all the monitoring you did for the measles outbreak. So that was a wonderful accomplishment to make people aware that they need to vaccinate their children. So here we are with the dietary guidelines for Americans, published recently by the Health and Human Services. They should have actually published them a few months ago, but they took their time after the committee of scientists has presented the report to them on what was evidence-based. So here we are, which the Health and Human Services said, we want to make America healthy again. And the question is it really? So here are my disclosures. And what I'll be doing today is review the dietary guidelines 2025-2030, discuss what's contradictory in those guidelines on healthy fats, and also discuss guidelines on the highly processed foods, added sugar, less alcohol, protein intake. I'm sure none of you are interested in the alcohol story, but unless there are some Ghalib type of people whom you know. So these dietary guidelines have to be done every 5 years. This is by law. And they choose scientists who have done nutrition research, and they are recognized nationally. And so they take about 2 years to get into all the evidence on the different questions that the Health and Human Services provide to them. So if you look at what the DGA, which is the Dietary Guidelines for Americans report, says, that we are in the midst of a health emergency. About 50% of the federal tax dollars are spent on healthcare, and a big chunk of it is spent on people with chronic diseases. And many of these diseases are preventable, often reversible, and are often tied to the food we eat and the amount of exercise we do. More than 70% of American adults are overweight or obese. Nearly 1 in 3 American adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17 has prediabetes. And so these problems really prevent people from joining military service, and which is a huge opportunity for a lot of people, which they cannot get because of the issue of being overweight and obese. So if you're really interested in the dietary guidelines advisory committee, you can go into, um, into your Google or wherever you want to go and get the guidelines if you're interested. There are lots of chapters in the guidelines. It's pretty huge and pretty intense. What they focused on is health equity. And this is giving all Americans equal opportunity to stay well, which the HHS, the Health and Human Services, the RFK Juniors division, has actually ignored it. And they also prevent evidence on diet and health. They focused on food sources of saturated fat because this is part of the contradiction in the guidelines that the government has released. So we also know that if a small amount of weight loss, a 15% weight loss reduction, can result in $1,000 per year in lower in Medicare spending, to lower Medicare spending. And 50% of Americans have pre-diabetes or diabetes. So this is pretty serious situation that we have in this country. In the previous guidelines, we had the data showing 6 in 10 adults are living with one or more diet-related chronic diseases. And in the past 5 years, nothing really has changed. It's become actually worse. I'm sure you are all familiar with the plate that the government put out and which was actually endorsed by even Michelle Obama. And this gave a picture of a plate with what should be put on it. So most of the plate should be occupied by different colored vegetables. And then we have the whole grains. And then the other parts will be the fruits, the protein, of course, the dairy to provide the essential nutrients like calcium and vitamin D and protein as well. What was interesting when I went to Ecuador as a health advisor, I found that they use a spoon, which was very interesting because the spoon also had the different food groups, but also focused on family eating together. I mean, right now we all are running around in different directions and very few families really eat together, but they focused on eating together and also focused on their farmers and the fisheries because these are the people that bring food to the table. So in the previous guidelines, we also had directions on how to eat properly, and we should be following a healthy dietary pattern at every stage of our lives. And the focus was on eating nutrient-dense foods and beverages, and also suitable for our cultural traditions. So, patients always, patients from South Asia will always be saying that, we can't be going to nutritionists or diabetes educators who don't understand our culture. So they focused on cultural differences and how we need to be aware of these differences. And the biggest focus was on lowering added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, like in salt, and also limit alcoholic beverages. Now, the two dietary patterns that have been really studied very well, particularly the Mediterranean, the top one, if you look at it, look at the color in it. Lots of vegetables, lots of fruits. There's a focus on fish. And of course, the kind of oil you should use, which is the extra virgin olive oil, preferably cold pressed. Um, and and then the lower one, which is the pyramid, has a foundation again of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and it emphasizes nutrients such as potassium, magnesium, calcium, vitamin D. These are the shortfall nutrients in our diets, and we have to be aware that we can only get them by including lots of vegetables and fruits of different colors. So the Mediterranean dietary pattern has been associated by lowering coronary heart disease risk by 29% to 69%, and also reducing the risk of stroke by 13 to 53%. And it also shows when you adhere to the Mediterranean diet, it's associated with a 20 to 23% reduction in developing diabetes. And you can lower your, if people who in the audience who know about diabetes or have family members with diabetes, they can lower their glycosylated hemoglobin, also known as hemoglobin A1C, in a very significant manner. And the way that these diets act is because they are anti-inflammatory and they're antioxidative. So you don't produce the free radicals because of all the antioxidants present in these vegetables and fruits and whole grains. So we also know that, the Mediterranean diet, though it is a little bit higher in fat, it's more like 35% calories come from fat. And if you compare it to a low-fat diet, it has an effect on the intermediate thickness of both the common carotid arteries. So if you look at the graph, the dark line is the Mediterranean diet, and the lighter line is a low-fat diet. So the Mediterranean diet, because it has all these anti-inflammatory components in it, has a better effect in the prevention of stroke. Again, just to emphasize, the DASH diet has been very effective in lowering blood pressure because, again, it emphasizes a diet that is low in saturated fat, low in total fat, cholesterol, and also it's rich in potassium, magnesium, calcium, as well as protein and fiber that we all lack in our diets. So going back to these inverted pyramid that the HHS has given us, it emphasizes foods like well-marbled steaks, which means lots of fat in it, full-fat milk, and butter. You see the stick of butter, and you see, beef tallow is encouraged to use in frying, and they have this whole chicken sitting right on top. And so you don't really get an idea of what the portion should be. It looks like go and eat your steaks, the steaks with a lot of marbling in it, a lot of fat in it. Eat this large portions of cheese and have whole milk and have butter. And there is a little piece of salmon sitting there, and there's some vegetables. And it doesn't focus on plant-based proteins at all, because you can get excellent amount of protein just from lentils, all the legumes, which they haven't emphasized. And what the USDA, Brooke Rollins, who's the director of USDA, said, you can actually manage a meal with $3. Just $3 can give you a meal. Imagine serving this for iftar. Ramzan is around the corner, so just look at it. This is what you can eat for $3. So the HHS, Kennedy's people, Kennedy himself, appointed these people to give Americans guidelines on how to eat. So several of these Kennedy's dietary advisors have ties to meat and dairy interests. 3 of the 9 members have received grants doing consulting work for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. They have received grants from the National Pork Board, and they have done work for, others have done work for red meat groups, and they have financial ties to the dairy industry. As well as, there's one person who did the high protein meal replacement. I mean, we at Columbia also had grants. We had grants from the Egg Board, and I was one of the investigators for it. But when you present data, which I presented at the American Heart Scientific Sessions, you say what you find. You don't manipulate results. You don't cook up the results just to please somebody who's given you the money. Of course, the egg board didn't like our results, but that's what it is. We followed the gold standard by doing a randomized controlled clinical trial and not just make up stories just to please them because they gave us some money. So when in these new dietary guidelines, they also are focusing on increasing more protein. You know, what we find from the data in the United States is most people are eating a lot of protein. But what they've said is instead of eating 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, increase it to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. There are people who do need more protein, that's the truth, because if you're doing a lot of exercise, resistance exercise, you'll probably need more protein. And of course, older people, as you get older, to make sure they don't get muscle waste or sarcopenia, so they need to make sure they get enough protein. But as it is, Americans are getting enough protein. They talk about healthy fats, and we have to now check what they mean by healthy fats. There are contradictions within the dietary guidelines and also between the dietary guidelines in the new pyramid. So they're recommending high sources of saturated fat, such as red meat, butter, beef tallow, and this becomes very confusing because this is not supported by science. If you eat a lot of saturated fat, your bad cholesterol, which is a low density lipoprotein or LDL cholesterol, will, will go up. And this is a risk factor for heart disease. So let's look at the different kinds of fats that we have in our supermarket shelves. You know, if you look at coconut oil, the red part of these bars denote how much saturated fat is there in that oil or fat. Coconut oil is over 90% saturated fat. So if you have coconut oil, just use it for your hair or skin, but just don't consume it because that's going to raise your LDL cholesterol. Butterfat, which the HHS is promoting, butterfat is over 64% saturated fat. And beef fat is around 45, 46%. If you look at pork fat, which they're also promoting, is close to 40%. And again, if you look at the vegetable oils, you have the blue portion, actually, it tells you how much of the unsaturated fat. There are different kinds of unsaturated fat. There is the linoleic acid, which is high in corn oil, in walnut oil, safflower oil, and there is also the yellow parts of the bars are the monounsaturated, like you find in olive oil, in almond oil. And this is what should be promoted, you know, getting more monounsaturated. But we also need a little bit of the polyunsaturated, the linoleic acid. But we also need another essential fatty acid, which is the alpha linolenic acid, which is in flaxseed oil, also a little bit in walnuts. So there's a way of meeting the needs by looking at the proportion of the different kinds of fatty acids in foods. So why are saturated fatty acids bad for us? Because first of all, it raises the LDL cholesterol, which is a risk factor for heart disease. It increases coagulation, the clotting of blood. It increases inflammation. It increases adiposity, which is more fat in the body. It increases insulin resistance, which leads to diabetes and increased risk for cardiovascular disease, heart disease, as well as type 2 diabetes. So it's some of the things that the dietary guidelines say is accurate. You have to eat the right amount of food. It depends on your age, your sex, your height, weight, and the level of physical activity. You have to pay attention to portion sizes. But unfortunately, the inverted pyramid has this whole big chicken, as I said, a big piece of steak with lots of fat on it. So that's not a proper portion to tell the people to eat. And they also says prioritize protein foods at every meal. That's fine as well, but it depends on how much you eat, how much protein you need to get for your size, your age, etc., and the amount of physical activity you do. And of course, hydration. A lot of people are not drinking enough water, and if you have to hydrate, you don't hydrate on sodas with sugar in it, but you hydrate on water. So if you look at the recommendations from around the world, if you look at the recommendations from the European Heart um, Association, the guidelines say that you should not have more than a certain amount of red meat. And it's let me get rid of this. And it's just to show you, how much saturated fat even a small serving of meat is. If you take 4 ounces of meat and you cook it, it shrinks to 3 ounces. That looks like a deck of playing cards. Just imagine a deck of playing cards, which has about almost 7 grams of saturated fat. So this is something you need to be aware of when you're putting a piece of red meat on your plate. So, but there are other protein foods. It doesn't mean when you say protein at every meal, it has to be a meat. It can be lentils, it can be your dals, it can be something that you make with soybeans or tofu. So if you look at dairy, the other recommendation from the HHS is to have full fat dairy. Now, if you look at this label, this is 1 cup of milk and it has 5 grams of saturated fat, which means if you're on a 2000 calorie diet, you already have consumed 25% because the HHS says that you should not increase saturated fat by over 10%, which is very confusing to people because if they're going to have 3 servings of milk every day, which means they've already reached 75% if you're on a 2000 calories. Most of us cannot eat 2000 calories and gain weight, especially women. Men who are very active or women who are very active can also eat 2000, but for most of us, we cannot eat 2000. We need few less calories. So you're really will be consuming a lot more than 10%. And so if you're going to add some chicken or some beef to or some mutton or lamb, you're going to go way past the 10% recommendation that they're making. So this is what's confusing to people. Of course, you need to take care of your gut health, and it's good to eat uh, lots of vegetables or having yogurt that has active cultures in it. This will help your microbiome to function and get rid of the bad bacteria and let the good bacteria thrive in your intestines. So yes, they also say eat vegetables, but they say eat throughout the day. And of course, the juices should definitely be limited in portions because at times we see it even at, I always go back to what people serve at iftars. I mean, you see these jugs of colored water filled with sugar in it, and this is what kids are drinking, or they have sodas, bottles of Coke, whatever, and that's again people drinking. If you drink a 12-ounce can of Coke, you're already getting 40 grams of sugar. That's like 10 teaspoons of sugar. And this is not something that is recommended because sugar consumption is associated also with chronic disease. So again, going back to the different kinds of fat, they're saying cook with healthy fats, and they're calling beef tallow, that's beef fat, healthy, which I've already shown to you that it's quite high in saturated fat. The whole grains recommendation is excellent. You need to get more whole grains. But what we see again at any of our functions is white rice, naans made with white flour. This is something to be aware of. How can we bring in more fiber? How can we bring in more vegetables? How can we bring in more plant proteins rather than just focusing on refined grains and meat? So yes, we cannot be, beef tallow should not be recommended. So even if you're going to be, if McDonald's or Burger King is going to be start frying with beef tallow, then you're again limited in terms of what's halal and what's not halal. The sugar, guideline is also good, not to have too much sugar. And what they're saying is also the children up to the age of 10 should not get any sugar. We've been recommended children under 2 should not get any sugar. And I think it becomes a little bit more challenging for parents to be able to control kids until they're 10 and not allow them to even have a gram of sugar. Because, things that are bought, even a cookie, you can land up with 15 grams of sugar in a cookie. That's like 4 teaspoons. Even if you sometimes even these healthy looking oatmeal packets, if you look at it carefully, they have sugar added to them, and it can be like having 3 teaspoons of sugar in one packet of oatmeal. This is something that we all need to pay attention to, is to read labels, but also to read the ingredients in it. And there are a lot of emphasis also on the dyes that are used, the colors that are used, the preservatives that are used. They're not all very healthy at all. So look for sulfites and nitrites, sorbates, all these preservatives and dyes. A lot of these different colors that are very attractive for children can be quite harmful. So again, going back to these guidelines, the math doesn't add up. As I said, if they're going to recommend 3 cups of whole milk and meat in protein in every meal, you'll go way past the 10% guideline for saturated fat. So this, leads me on to thinking about Ramadan, which is around the corner. And I think it's important what we can do to improve the health of our families and friends, especially what we serve at community centers and mosques, and also foods that serve to children. I'm always very sort of upset, almost disappointed that, children are just given the pizza, or they're given this pasta full of fat in it with nothing else, or they're given fried chicken. I think this is something we all need to pay attention to, because it's a whole month and some people come very regularly, thinking how we can improve. Hopefully the iftar table will be more colorful and have a lot more vegetable dishes rather than meat with an inch of oil floating on it, which I see all the time. And it's really important to become aware that we shouldn't be consuming so much fat, and especially all the unhealthy fats. So again, this is a time to reset for Ramadan, good time to see physicians for patients who have diabetes or need medication adjustment. And it's also to understand, because so many people have diabetes, to understand what it means to have glycemic control during Ramadan. And also the lipids, the cholesterol does go up in a month, in 4 weeks. We've done studies on it. And people who have problems with high triglycerides, if you eat a high fat meal, you eat your iftar, whatever you eat, then you have the dinner, then you have a dessert, which is full of saturated fat. There are chances that your triglycerides can go up very high and you can have abdominal pain, and people who have chronic um, high triglyceride levels, it can be quite dangerous for them as well. So education is important, and studies have shown that there's a clear benefit of Ramadan-focused education program in terms of glycemic control, weight loss, and a reduced risk of hypoglycemia, which can be quite dangerous. What we've done is I had proposed that we look at what religious fasting does to on what impact it has on cardiometabolic health. This was of great interest to me, so I proposed that we should um, do some research on all the different religions in South Asia and see what effect it has on cardiometabolic health. The National Lipid Association's Journal of Clinical Lipidology, was having a supplement on South Asians, and they liked this idea very much. But when we really went into the research, what we found was the religious fasting of Islam, Christianity, and the Baha'i faith, we found may promote cardiometabolic health. But you can't do randomized controlled clinical trials. All you have is prospective data, and it could promote cardiometabolic health. But if you look at the data on Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, they have very limited data because the way they fast is not really a complete fast. I mean, they would, you know, eat at different times or have different kinds of liquids, which also include whole milk. So it was very difficult to come up with. So finally, the Journal of Clinical Lipidology suggested we should publish as a perspective rather than a paper. And so that was put together, and it has been accepted. So we are looking forward for its publication. But what the need is that to inform the healthcare providers that religious fasting can have an effect on nutrient consumption, on side effects like hypoglycemia, that they have to be aware of it. And a lot of non-Muslim healthcare providers may not know that, and this would be very helpful to them to understand the impact of religious fasting on cardiometabolic health. So we've always had the traditions of our prophet, which focus on moderation as a way of maintaining good health. And the Quran stresses the need to strike a balance between any extreme. So we've had guidelines for 1400 years, but I think we needed the evidence for it, and now we have them. So I'll conclude by saying our health is in our hands, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much for that incredibly informative presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers did as well. Just a reminder to those following along with us on YouTube, please enter your questions into the chat function, and we will ask them to our presenter. But just to begin, I know one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is that we're struggling in public health with this environment where there's a lot of misinformation or conflicting information about health topics, including nutrition. So I was wondering if you could give us some pointers on how do we know what sources to trust and where are the best places to find credible information about nutrition and our health?
First of all, if you're looking at published data, you can go into PubMed and look for peer-reviewed journals. If you want to look on any particular topic to see, they have systematic reviews. There are a lot of reviews done also on Ramadan fasting. So you can look there on saturated fat, on cholesterol intake. And, even the cholesterol part of it, it became from being a bad thing to becoming a good thing. And now they're promoting eggs. But we did studies, as I said, on eggs. And what we found was, egg cholesterol is dietary cholesterol, regardless from whether it's from eggs or beef or chicken or, any other source of animal food. People don't respond in the same way as they respond to saturated fat. Saturated fat is a lot more potent, but what we found with dietary cholesterol, there are hyper responders and hypo responders. So that there were people who didn't respond to increased intake. We even fed them 4 eggs a day. And this was all randomized, which means it's a blinded study. We had to prepare recipes where we could actually not disclose whether there were egg yolks in it or there were no egg yolks. So it was very beautifully planned, meal plans for them, and we actually prepared them to feed our subjects. So we had a whole team of food preparers. So you look at published data, but you also look at organizations such as the American Heart. They publish evidence-based science. American Diabetes Association, their guidelines come out every January, and they're all updated. I have been on one of those committees that updated clinical guidelines, and I know how rigorous it is, how carefully we go through data to show what's, very significant or moderately significant. We have to say that. So you go into these. There are also the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and we have a evidence-based library. I was the chair of the first one on disorders of lipid metabolism, where we can collect so much evidence to sort out and then rate the evidence, whether it's very good or just good or fair or not conclusive. So you have to go to these organizations, and depending on your interest, of course, you have the Kidney Foundation, you have these different foundations, you have the pediatrics, but you have to go into them, and the best is to look at published data in peer-reviewed journals.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I think, and you touched upon this as well, that one of the most important elements of building trust is knowing where the information is coming from and what the science is behind it. So you spoke a little bit about, the process of doing a randomized trial. Could you speak a little bit more about how, in particular with your own research, how research in nutrition is conducted, the types of studies and processes you use, and also who is included in that process?
To do studies is very expensive. It costs millions of dollars, and it's not easy to get grants. And, sometimes people say, oh, these nutrition studies, they've been funded by industry. And so this has also been looked at very carefully. And what they found is about 13% of the funding comes from industry for nutrition research. And most of it is from the meat and dairy industry. So, and what we're seeing now is so much cutbacks, I think like 40% cutbacks from NIH to do research. So there is, very limited amount of money. Even if you look at, we did a study called Diet Effects on Lipoproteins and Thrombogenic Activity in the 1990s, and it was like $10 million. Can you imagine what it's going to cost now if you do it? We were looking at the effect of comparing the average American diet, which is high in fat, to a diet that's also high in fat, but high in monounsaturated fat, which means using fats like canola oil, using olive oil, using avocado. These are high in monounsaturated. And then also comparing it to a lower fat diet and seeing which is best for our health. So and when the kinds of people, it depends on who we want to study. We wanted to look at healthy people. So it was very convenient for us to tap into Columbia students. We got a whole bunch of medical students who were so eager to join because they were going to save a lot of money when they were getting this free food for 6 weeks. Um, so it depends on whom most we also had a clinical research center in the institute I worked for, in the Irving Institute, and there we brought in patients and they stayed there. And we had patients who were on weight reduction, and they had to drink only formula, and we had technicians preparing formula, which were carefully measured and also analyzed to make sure. So it's very rigorous when you do research. And when this evidence comes out and we say, okay, please don't eat so much saturated fat, and the government then says, drink three cups of whole milk a day and fry your food with beef tallow. That people have to understand there is and it's a huge concern. You're misleading the people when we have the evidence, so much evidence to say saturated fat is bad for us, just like the evidence we had for trans fat, and the government took action. So we need to make sure people understand when you take fat out of milk, if you take a cup of whole milk, it has it has like 2 teaspoons of fat in it. So when you take 2% fat milk, it has 1 teaspoon of fat. If you take, that's in a cup of milk. And if you take a cup of 1% fat milk, it has half a teaspoon of fat. So if you remove the fat, you're not removing any other nutrients. The protein stays there, the vitamin A stays there, vitamin D stays there, calcium stays there, nothing is removed. All you're removing is the fat, which has a lot of saturated fat in it. So people have to understand that, by not drinking the whole milk, you're not missing out in any nutrient that you need. So this is as a result of research for a long time. The same time, you have to remember that, nutrition research progresses. It's nothing stationary. You have to continue to do. People put trans fat in foods because it helps to increase shelf life, or you got a better texture in food, or the food was cheaper. A croissant made with hydrogenated fat, which is solid fat, is is flakier, it has better texture, but then it's also harmful for you. So then you get to the research to say, okay, trans fat is definitely bad for us. It raises the LDL, and it was also decreasing the HDL. But now people should not focus so much on HDL. So we have moved on even in the lipid research. You focus on LDL cholesterol, and people say, listen, I've been eating coconut oil and my HDL is high. But that doesn't mean you're in better health, because there could be mutations in HDL that can actually have a negative impact on heart health. So, science keeps progressing. We cannot be stagnant. We have hypotheses, and those have to be tested in a properly controlled study. It's easier to do studies on medications because you give a certain amount of drugs, and the patients bring back empty bottles or bottles with leftover medication, and the research assistants count everything and can. But with diet studies, it's really hard to be able to say, what people are really eating at home. So if you really have to do a proper study, you have to feed them everything. or you have to bring them and make them live on your premises and keep that control, which is very hard to do and very, very expensive.
Thank you for that. And we have a question from the chat. This person is saying, thank you for the very informative talk, and asking, how safe is the process of fat removal from milk and other dairy products?
How safe is it?
Yes.
It's very safe. If you remove the fat, you're just removing the fat, and you're removing the fat, which is, a high in saturated fat, which is like 64% saturated fat. So you're just removing the fat, you're not removing any nutrients, so it's very safe. But it has to be pasteurized to be safe. You cannot have raw milk because raw milk will have E. coli, it can have, you know, um, all the bacteria that can cause disease. So you have to make sure it's pasteurized. And when you store milk also, once you open the container, you cannot drink it past 7 days. A lot of people don't understand that. They look at the date and okay, if the date is February 20th, and they're opening the carton today, they cannot drink until February 20th because they've opened. They have to get rid of it. There comes the issue of safety, because that's what you need to follow. Once you open your container of milk, you can only drink it within 7 days, and then you have to chuck it. Same thing with oils. When you're storing oils, if you're opening a bottle, if it's dark colored, keep it in a dark place, keep it in a cabinet. But again, once you open the bottle, you have to use it within a couple of months. You cannot keep it for a year and use the same bottle. So you have to be very careful. Those are the safety issues that people need to follow. Even cross-contamination between raw meats and vegetables. You have to have different, boards to cut on. Those things are important, and kinds of board you use is important. So nothing is wrong with skim milk or low-fat milk. So all that's done to it is the fat is removed, the nutrients remain in the milk.
There's also a question here. Can you touch on the current recommendations on the average amount of safe egg consumption in a week?
Consumption of what?
Consumption of eggs.
Oh, the eggs. That's a good question. The egg is egg white, which is pure protein, albumin. Eat as much as you want, unless you've been told for some reason to restrict your protein intake. The yellow part is the yolk that has the cholesterol. One large egg yolk has 180 milligrams of cholesterol. For the most part, if you're going to eat 7 eggs a week, may not be an issue. If you eat even more, may not be an issue. But if you have diabetes, there are studies to show that people who have diabetes should control that dietary cholesterol intake. So the only way you can know if you're a hyper-responder or a hypo-responder is by taking a baseline measurement of your lipids, do the total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, triglycerides, etc., and then measure again after 6 weeks or 8 weeks and see, by consuming more eggs, did you respond in a negative way? That's the only way you can tell, because it's very hard to say what's a safe amount, considering what research has shown that there are people who can respond to it but not respond. But people who have diabetes, who have a risk for heart disease. If you're a male with diabetes, it doubles your risk for heart disease. If you're a female, it quadruples your risk for heart disease. I think those people should be more careful and perhaps limit egg yolks to maybe 4 per week and see how they're doing. And if they eat more, just be aware that they need to be consulting their physicians to check again on their lipid levels.
Thank you for that. And I think it was very helpful that you spoke about Ramzan coming up and, provided some advice on how to plan a more balanced iftar and sehi. Could you speak a little bit more about how these dietary guidelines can apply to a lot of the foods that we traditionally eat during Ramzan? And especially one of the things you mentioned was um, white rice or rotis or naans that are made with white flour. So what are some healthier alternatives to those things?
If people like white rice, I tell them, okay, if you have white rice, but add to it, um, you know, like lentils, legumes, add lots of vegetables. And even if you make pulaus, you can have a lot of vegetables on the side. Um, and if you make it with brown rice, it'll be fantastic. But most people will not like it. So I understand that. And so you make it healthier by using a proper oil in it. Use canola or high monounsaturated sunflower oil, or use olive oil. I use olive oil in everything. I use the extra virgin. I use cold pressed, and the biryani doesn't taste like Italian food. It tastes like biryani if I make it, or if I make dal, it tastes like dal. So you can make it, but it's good to have, less meat, more vegetables, and even like say, for instance, you have, dahi baras for iftar. You can make it with non-fat yogurt, and that's better than putting full fat yogurt. So though that's available, if you go to Trader Joe's, you can get this European style non-fat yogurt with active cultures. It's fantastic. Something like that could be used. I mean, you can buy Stonyfield if you want, but get the non-fat. And even in the desserts, I've seen people opening up cans of fruit with sugar syrup and mixing it with heavy cream, and that's a dessert. I mean, that's not a dessert that should be consumed. Maybe fresh fruit can be there. I mean, a little bit of sweet stuff, it's okay. But again, that shouldn't be the focus. People are eating actually one meal, and you're eating breakfast. I don't know what the breakfast is for most people. I'm sure they're not eating it like a lunch. They're probably eating something light. So I think that one meal, we should make sure that if you're doing for a community, we also provide a lot vegetables and lentils and non-fat yogurt, dairy, bring in all the food groups, but all in a very healthy combination that people can enjoy and feel good about it after they leave for the next Rosa.
All right, last question here. Do you have some places where we can find simple meal ideas that follow the correct dietary guidelines?
Oh, it's if you're thinking of the kind of food that South Asians will eat, um, there are some resources, but not a complete one anywhere. You just have to do some modifications, because even if you look at our styles of eating, and people who come from certain regions will eat in a different way. If you come from I don't know, different parts, I guess, Sindh or Punjab or South India, wherever. We all have different ways of eating. But I think all we have to remember is, what fat should we be using? It's okay to use your grains, I mean, I'm not expecting in people to bring in a quinoa salad, but if you're making a salad, at least put in different colored vegetables in it. Throw in some fruit if you want to make it tasty. Use a nice dressing with olive oil in it. I think pay attention to the ingredients rather than you. I don't think you'll find a proper meal. I found nutritionists writing, even Indians, but they would use ghee, and ghee is a saturated fat. People get very emotional when I tell them, okay, ghee is not so good for you, but because they brought up with ghee, but a lot of people use just a little bit, like My friends tell me, oh, my Gujarati friends, oh, they use just a teaspoon in their khichdis. I said, okay, that's fine if you need the flavor. But again, ghee is also high. It's butter. It's clarified butter, so it's high in saturated fat. But I think if you pay attention to the ingredients to see how you can bring in the vegetables and don't overcook the vegetables. I mean, some of the vegetables that are served, they kill them. They're overcooked. They are, I've seen people serve trays of delicious looking spinach, but butter floating on it. I mean, these are the things, the ingredients you have to focus on rather than the vegetables. Cook it to a level, make the roasted broccoli with desi spices, if you wish. It's pretty tasty, or cauliflower. I would love to see all that so that people will feel better. I can assure you, people may say, what's going on with these people? Where is all our halim and nihari and all that stuff? But when you see vegetables too, they're going to feel better the next day. And I think we have to focus on the ingredients.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's a good place to end. First, I want to thank the attendees for taking some time out of your Sunday to join us and discuss this important topic. Thank you for your engagement and for your questions. I also want to thank the organizers, Dr. Huma Naqvi and Dr. Nazneen Zaidi, who are IMI Women's Wing coordinators, Ms. Varda Batul and Mr. Asher Zaidi, who helped us coordinate the webinar. And then, of course, very sincere thank you to Dr. Vahida Karamali for sharing this information with us. Thank you to all of the people I mentioned, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for all of your efforts in helping our community live healthier lives. As we wrap up, please just join me in reciting a salawat for the tawfiq of these individuals and their families. And wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.